So, Paul, your English, your training is in geology, paleontology, paleobiology. You studied in London, and yet you are a creationist. I believe that most geologists, most biologists, and most paleontologists in UK are evolutionists. It seems that UK, as France, is really atheistic nowadays. So how did you get to be a creationist? And why trusting the Bible after all? It doesn't seem to be a common thing in England.
Yeah, well, there's a long story there. I'll have to try and keep it short, I think. But I grew up in a home where my parents weren't believers, except in the most nominal sense. They did send me to Sunday school at the local parish church. But it wasn't until I was 10 years old that a friend invited me to a local evangelical church, to their youth group. And it was while I was there that I became a Christian. And my parents became Christians actually after that. They came to church to find out, you know, what had happened to me, and were sort of interested in that, and ended up becoming believers as well. My dad actually became a church pastor later on. So that was how I became a Christian. I'd always had an interest in science, in particularly geology, fossils, dinosaurs, and those kinds of things, you know, like many young boys have. And I guess when I became a Christian, I wanted to sort of understand how these things fitted together with my Christian faith. And I came across some creationist literature. I'm not sure who gave it to me or how I found it, but I read a little booklet called Bone of Contention by Sylvia Baker, who I later got to know. We served together on the committee of the Biblical Creation Society, but Sylvia's booklet was one of the first things I read when I was a teenager, and various other things. And I became a convinced creationist quite early on as a teenager. When I got to about the age of, you know, when I was leaving school, I was about the age of 16 or 17, I knew that I wanted to serve God in this area of creationism. I didn't know how that would happen, how that would work, but I knew that if I was going to do that, I needed to study biology and geology, because those were the two sort of key areas that I needed to know about. So my first degree was a combined science degree where I was able to do some geology and biology, but I majored in geology. And I was a creationist through my time, you know, studying those things. I didn't make a big deal of it, but people did find out that I was a creationist when I was doing my first degree, and that created some interesting situations at times. I went on to do my master's actually at University College London. That was sometime later, because after I sort of graduated with my first degree, I worked in a secular job for some time. And I was involved with the Biblical Creation Society, and I was doing lots of speaking and writing for them. And I later on actually went back to study for my master's. And I chose a geoscience. That was the area I was most interested in. And particularly, I sort of chose all of the most evolutionary modules that I was able to choose. So I sort of focused on paleobiology, which is the study of fossils and the history of life. So reconstructing the history of life from large-scale patterns in the fossil record. And my research project was actually on looking at the diversity of dinosaurs. And my supervisor was a dinosaur paleontologist, quite well known in that community. And I knew I had to tell him, if I wanted him to supervise me, I knew I had to tell him I was a creationist, because you know, I wanted just to be open with him about that. But had he Googled my name, he'd have found out that I was a creationist anyway. So I thought, you know, I need to tell him. And he was quite surprised, I think, when I told him that I was a creationist. But I have to say, I was very grateful, because he didn't treat me any differently than any other student. he was very good to me, because I you know, you do hear about some creationists who have a very difficult time when their supervisor finds out that they're a creationist. But I have to say that my supervisor was extremely good to me, and you know, he treated me very fairly, just as any other student, I think.
Okay. Okay, Paul, as you mentioned, you're a creationist, and I would like you to explain why you think the creationist view is better than the evolutionist view as it comes to explaining the fossil record and the geologic record. In general terms, I know, because it's very, very large topic.
Yes, huge topic. Well, I think first and foremost, I'd kind of want to put scripture at the forefront, because the reason I'm a creationist primarily is because of what the Bible teaches. I think the Bible is you know, is clear about this, that there was a recent creation, there was a worldwide flood, and so on. So it's scripture primarily that gets me to the creationist position. But then, of course, we you know, with that scriptural foundation, we want to understand the world around us. And I believe that the Bible gives us a key to understand what we're seeing in the natural world. And when it comes to the fossil record, there are a number of very large scale sort of observations that you can make about the fossil record that I think fit very well with the creationist perspective. So we have, for example, extremely widespread sedimentary rock layers that cover the continents. You know, they're found up on the high continents, the high standing continents, and these are marine sediments primarily. And if you look at North America, for example, there's a sandstone layer. You can see it in the base of Grand Canyon. It's called the Tapete Sandstone, but you can trace it across the North American continent. And it's given different names locally. You know, when you cross state boundaries, you know, they give it different names, but it's effectively part of the same sort of blanket of marine sandstone. So we have these marine sediments, very, very widespread, and you can actually find those same sediments, similar sedimentary patterns on other continents. So if you come to Britain, I can show you something very similar to the Tapete Sandstone here in Britain, resting again on crystalline basement rocks, just as it is in Grand Canyon. You can see it in other parts of the world too. So these are really big scale patterns, and those marine sediments contain fossils. They contain marine organisms that are fossilized, often showing evidence of rapid burial. Fossils are very abundant. If you look in the present day, fossilization is a rare event. Most organisms obviously don't end up being fossilized, but we have an abundance of fossils in the fossil record, often testifying to circumstances, as I say, of rapid burial. So when we look at these sort of large scale patterns, I think we can see that this fits the picture of a worldwide flood, because what would we expect in a worldwide flood? We think that the flood began in the oceans. We think that the ocean waters transgressed onto the continents to cover the land. And we see, you know, these very extensive marine sediments on the continents, full of marine fossils, evidence of rapid burial. That, to me, at least, you know, when you look at the big picture, it looks like the kind of thing that you would expect from the biblical picture of a worldwide flooding of the continents. So.
And there are global features, like when you compare continent to continent, there's something, it's coherent. Can you expand upon that?
Yes. Well, if you look at the geological column, which is a kind of summary of the stack of rock layers, and if you look at the stack of rock layers in North America, and then you compare it to what we see in Europe, you can see some very common features. So at the base of the fossil record, as I mentioned, you know, we have this Tapete Sandstone, this very extensive sandstone layer, similar sandstones here in Britain, in other parts of Europe, and in Northern Africa and in the Middle East. We see limestones in the Devonian. We see very similar Devonian limestones, you know, across multiple continents. Carboniferous coals, You know, we find the Carboniferous coal layers spanning all the way from the coal basins in North America right through to the Ukraine in southeastern Europe. We see chalk in the Upper Cretaceous, those chalk layers, again, extremely widespread. So there are various chalks that you can see in North America, like the Austin chalk in Texas and the Selma chalk in Alabama. Obviously, we find the chalk here in Britain. It makes up the famous White Cliffs, you know, on the southern coast of England. It underlies much of Europe, much of Denmark, for example. But you can trace it right down to Turkey and Israel. There are even Upper Cretaceous chalks in Australia, in Western Australia. So again, extremely extensive, and you find these effectively at the same stratigraphic level, the same level in the sequence of geological layers. So we have global patterns, and of course, when you see a global pattern, that cries out for a global explanation. And as creationists, we have that explanation in the worldwide flood.
Okay, very, very interesting. The evolutionists say that life evolved from sea to land, from fish to tetrapod. What would be the creationist response? And why would a fish venture into land while it's very well adapted to sea?
Yeah, so this transition from sort of fish to tetrapods are animals that have 4 limbs with digits rather than fins like a fish. This transition is regarded as one of the major events in the history of life. It's thought to have taken place in evolutionary terms, actually not from the sea, but really from freshwater environments where fish were, you know, effectively becoming tetrapods and evolving for life in a terrestrial environment. And one of the interesting things is when we look at the fossil record, we do see what seems to be a compelling kind of evolutionary sequence. So we have a sequence of fossils beginning with fishes which look like kind of generic sort of fishes that you might imagine. And then you have fishes a bit higher in the sequence that look a bit more sort of tetrapod-like. They have flattened bodies, elongated snouts, so they're just a little bit more tetrapod-like. And then a bit higher still in the sequence, we have some very unusual fishes like Tiktaalik, the famous Tiktaalik that was found in Arctic Canada, where it has almost wrist-like and elbow-like joints in the fins and a flexible neck, which, you know, modern fishes, you know, don't have. And then a bit higher still in the sequence, we have tetrapods, but these are very unusual tetrapods. So they're some of them have been found in Greenland, like Ichthyostega and Acanthostega, and these are tetrapods that look quite fish-like. They have limbs with digits, but they're paddle-like limbs. They have strange numbers of digits. Acanthostega, I think, has 8 digits on the hands, on the forelimbs. Ichthyostega has 7 digits on the hind limbs. So these are very strange fish-like tetrapods, and they have some other fish-like features as well. They have sort of fin-like tails. They have a lateral line, which is a sort of sensory organ on a fish, and they have those. They have external gills. And then a bit higher still in the fossil record, we have much more terrestrial looking tetrapods. So evolutionists look at this sequence and they say, well, this looks like an evolutionary transition, right? This is a classic sort of transitional series. There is a kind of fly in the ointment. There is a problem because some years ago, some fossil footprints were discovered in Middle Devonian rocks in Poland. And these fossil footprints, not only, these are clearly tetrapod footprints. There has been some debate about, you know, whether they are truly tetrapod footprints, but I think the consensus is that is what they are. They not only predate the oldest tetrapod body fossils, they actually predate the oldest sort of ancestral fishes in the fossil record. So there is this sort of problem in that we
the
have these
grandparents paradox.
yes, so kind of a temporal paradox, and so that sort of muddies this sort of neat picture. But the other thing to say is that as creationists, we can begin to do some research on these transitional fossils, and one of the tools that we can use are the tools provided to us by baraminology. Baraminology, I don't know whether you've heard that term, but it comes from the Hebrew. It's kind of a hybrid term. Baramin is from the Hebrew. It's bara, which is create, and min, which is kind. So baraminology is the study of the created kinds. And we have a number of sort of scientific tools that we can use within baraminology to study fossil organisms. And if you're an evolutionist, what you would expect to find when you look at a transitional series like the fish to tetrapod sequence is it should be a nice one big continuous sequence, right? That there should be no gaps in that sequence. It should be a smooth transition. But when we actually study these fossil organisms, and myself and a student some years ago published a paper on this, looking at specifically at the fossil organisms that are part of this fish tetrapod sequence, we found that they do actually fall into discrete clusters. So you do have a morphological gap between even the most fish-like tetrapods and the most tetrapod-like fish. They can still be separated out into discrete groups, and there aren't fossils that fill that morphological gap. So it's really interesting. They do seem to fall into multiple groups, which we would interpret as created kinds, as created groups. So it's not a smooth sequence as perhaps it first appears. When you look at sort of and drill down into the detail, you find actually multiple groups that don't cluster together. And so that's interesting, but then that still leaves us with the question, well, why does this look like a transitional sequence? Why are the fossils found in this order in the rock layers? Why does that look like an evolutionary sequence? And I think the key there for us as creationists is to understand something of the pre-flood world. So if you think about how the flood worked, the flood was a transgressive event. It began in the oceans. The flood waters then transgressed onto the land, and as the flood waters advanced, they picked off and buried successive communities of organisms that were living in that pre-flood world. And these particular organisms, these fishes and tetrapods, it seems were inhabiting a very unusual pre-flood ecosystem, which Dr. Kurt Wise has reconstructed. He actually reconstructed it based on fossil plants, but it also helps us to explain then these fishes and tetrapods. This ecosystem was a floating forest. It was a massive continent-sized environment that was located over the ocean in the pre-flood world. And it was a bit like a quaking bog that grows out over a lake in the modern world, but it was much bigger and it was over the ocean. And so you had in the center of the forest, there would have been even substantial trees, large trees. But as you went to the margins of the floating forest, there would have been much smaller, more water dependent plants. And so this was a kind of transitional ecology. It was a transitional ecosystem, something between sea and land. And these fishes and tetrapods appear to have been inhabitants of that floating forest ecosystem. They were inhabiting an environment that was kind of transitional. And so God equipped them with transitional morphologies that would enable them to live in that environment. So the fishes were obviously living in the aquatic sort of environment. You had more terrestrial tetrapods that could have been in the center of the mat, of this floating mat of vegetation. And then in between, there would have been sort of transitional environments, maybe shallow ponds where these tetrapods needed to be more aquatic, where perhaps the mat wouldn't be able to fully bear their weight. So they were more aquatic adapted animals. And so as the flood sort of tears this floating forest apart during the flood, as it sort of rips this thing apart from the outside inwards, it would bury first of all the fishes, then it would bury the more transitional tetrapods, and then it would bury last the more terrestrial tetrapods, and you would get what looked like an evolutionary sequence but was actually an ecological sequence. So I think we have, you know, a way of sort of explaining this sequence from a creationist perspective.
Okay, so we have transitional environments with sort of transitional animals. Okay, and how is this received in the creationist community? Because I know we have some debates. Where does the flood start, or where does it end? The floating forest hypothesis. We have different camps, and I think you know more than me about this. But I know some creationists, they don't believe in the floating forest hypothesis. Some do. So can you explain us what's the debate about that?
Yeah. There are all kinds of debates within creationism about the details, obviously, of how we interpret the scientific data. As you say, one of the big ones is about where does the flood begin and end in the geological record. And there are different views about that. My view is that the flood ends probably around the end of the Mesozoic, which is the point in the geological record where the dinosaurs disappear. They sort of disappear at the end of the Mesozoic. And I think then the younger rocks, which we call the Cenozoic, I think those are post-flood. But there are creationists who put much of the Cenozoic in the flood as well. So there are these kinds of debates about sort of details about where exactly the flood begins and ends. There has been some dissent about the floating forest. Tim Clary and others have sort of pushed back a bit on the floating forest. I personally think that the floating forest has a pretty substantial sort of evidential basis. I think it's pretty solid. I'm not sure that the criticisms that have been made are a kind of fatal to the floating forest hypothesis. So I think it's pretty sound, and it explains, to me, it explains an awful lot, because the floating forest not only explains the order of the fossil plants that we find in the record, it also explains the anatomy of the plants, because when you look at the anatomy of these plants, they appear to be many of them designed for life in aquatic environments, where they have hollow roots and hollow stems, and the way that the roots are arranged appear to be what you'd expect from, you know, plants that are basically floating in water. But it also explains why there's a close association of the coal plants and these fossil plants with marine sediments. It helps to explain, as I mentioned earlier, the fossil series of fishes and tetrapods. So there's lots and lots of things, and when you have a hypothesis that can explain such a wide range of observations in science, that's quite powerful. You know, that begins to give you some confidence that, you know, maybe you're on the right track here. So I know there, as there always is in science, you know, that there's pushback and counter arguments, but on the whole, I think the floating forest is on a pretty well, I was going to say it's on solid ground, but that wouldn't be right, would it?
Yeah, and the quaking bog ground. So yeah, you mentioned the plants, and this is an argument put forward by the evolutionists. They said, why don't we find angiosperms, I think we call them, or flowering plants? Why don't we find them at the bottom of the Cambrian? If creation is true, we should find them. They would tell us, but the floating forest hypothesis is helping to explain that, apparently.
Yeah, that's right. There are still some things which are quite difficult to explain. I think ecology helps to explain an awful lot. You know, if you're successively burying different ecologies, this helps to explain an awful lot about the fossil order. I still scratch my head a little bit about the absence of flowering plant pollen, because pollen today gets everywhere. You know, pollen is easily distributed, and we don't find flowering plant pollen in those older rocks. But there's all kinds of things about the pre-flood world that we perhaps don't fully understand, maybe about how those plants are actually reproducing, and also about things like wind patterns. And yeah, there's so many things we don't understand about the pre-flood world. And we're really only at the beginning of trying to make sense of all of this. We're a very small community.
Not many scientists.
Very many of us. Yeah.
I know the Institute of Creation Research is doing some studies about this, and maybe we will know a bit more soon.
Yeah.
So then we've got another interesting case of evolution, which would be the evolution of some synapsids, we call them, or therapsids. Sometimes we call them mammalian reptiles.
Yes.
Tricky term. And these mammalian reptiles, if we grant the term, they would have evolved into mammals. And I think I've heard evolutionists saying that it's one of the best cases of evolution. Yeah. So what can we say about this as creationists?
Yes, this reptile mammal transition has been referred to as the crown jewel of evolution. One of the best examples of an evolutionary transition. It's a bit like the fish tetrapod transition that I talked about. So just to kind of put this in context, as we talk about this and we're focusing on these transitional sequences, people may get the impression that actually there are lots of these transitional sequences. Actually, one of the most striking things about the fossil record is the absence of transitional series. We do have a relatively small handful of really good examples. They're mostly from the vertebrates, it seems. But in most cases, groups appear in the fossil record abruptly without being led up to by these kinds of transitional series. So we ought to just sort of say that to put that in context. But yeah, to come to the reptile mammal sequence, because it is, again, it's one of these ones that seems very convincing. So evolutionists point to a number of different changes that you can see through the fossil record. One of the most significant differences between reptiles and mammals, at least when you look at the skeletal anatomy, because obviously we don't, generally speaking, have the soft anatomy, is in the structure of the jaws. So if you look at reptiles have a jaw which is made up of multiple bones, whereas in mammals, including humans, we have just one bone in the lower jaw. It's called the dentary bone. And what we have, unlike reptiles, is we have a cluster of small bones that make up the inner ear, the ear bones. We call them the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, I think. So we have these ear bones, and the idea that evolutionists have is that the bones of the lower jaw that made up the reptile lower jaw migrated through the course of evolution to become those ear bones, those middle ear bones in mammals. And remarkably, we do have a series of fossils that, again, evolutionists point to and say, well, this is evidence of this evolutionary transition. So when we look at reptiles like pelycosaurs, people may be familiar with the Dimetrodon, sometimes included in your little bag of plastic dinosaurs, but it's not a dinosaur. It's another kind of reptile called a pelycosaur. They have a pretty standard reptile-like jaw joint. So the jaw joint there is actually, they have a connection between the lower jaw and the upper jaw, between two bones called the quadrate and the articular bone. The dentary bone is at the front of the jaw, and then there are other non-dentary bones at the back of the jaw. And as I say, the jaw joint is between the quadrate and the articular bone. But then when you get a bit higher in the fossil sequence, we have other animals called cynodonts, and some of these early cynodonts, they have the non-dentary bones at the back of the jaw have actually been reduced in size, so they're much smaller. And then we even have some cynodonts that have a kind of double jaw joint. So they have both, they have two jaw joints. They have the reptile jaw joint between the quadrate and the articular bone, but they also have the same jaw joint that mammals have between the dentary and the squamosal bone. So they have a double jaw joint, which is interesting. And then a bit higher in the sequence, you have animals, mammal-like animals that have a more traditionally mammalian kind of jaw with the mammalian jaw joint. And there's even one organism called Yanaconodon that has middle ear bones, but the middle ear bones are connected to the lower jaw, unlike, you know, our middle ear bones. So again, you know, evolutionists look at that and say, wow, this looks like a really convincing sort of sequence where you have the evolution from the reptile-like jaw arrangement to the mammalian jaw arrangement. And again, you know, we referred earlier to baraminology, the study of the created kinds. And Dr. Matt McLean and some of his students have done some work applying baraminology to the reptile-mammal transition. And they've found the same thing that I found with the fossil fishes and tetrapods, which is that rather than finding a single sort of smooth, continuous evolutionary series, these different organisms actually fall into discrete clusters. They fall into discrete groups, which are clearly discontinuous from one another. As creationists, we'd expect to find continuity within created kinds, where the organisms are all very similar to one another. But we'd expect those created kinds to be separated by discontinuity from other created kinds, because they were created separately. And that is what we find even among these reptile mammal fossils. We find discrete groups separated by discontinuity. And one of the interesting things is, if you look in the evolutionary literature, they also talk about discontinuity in the reptile mammal sequence. So many of these, what we call them in quotation marks, the mammal-like reptiles, many of them just seem to pop up in the fossil record at about the same time on multiple continents, you know, in Russia and South Africa, and they pop up and they're not led up to by a transitional series of fossils. They just sort of all appear simultaneously. And the question of, you know, what's the ancestor? Well, the ancestor appears to be unknown at this time. So that's interesting, because it kind of fits with this creationist view that they are actually discrete groups. They're not part of a single continuous sequence. So again, you know, how do we explain it? How do we explain this fossil series? I think probably ecology is going to be the key again here. You know, if you could imagine in the pre-flood world, we had kind of reptile dominated communities and we had mammal dominated communities, and maybe in between those, geographically in between them, maybe there was some kind of intermediate community where you had these reptile-like mammals were living, you know, kind of intermediate ecology with animals that had an intermediate anatomy and physiology. And if you bury those environments in sequence, if you bury the reptiles first and then the reptile-like mammals and then the mammals, you would have what appears to be an evolutionary sequence, but which it may in fact be an ecological sequence.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, again, it's different environments. The world, the pre-flood world was, we think it was much different from the world today. So
yes, yeah, and the other thing to point out is that you're right, the pre-flood world was different, and also the life in the pre-flood world was different. So it was much more biologically diverse. So we look at the world today and we're looking at an impoverished world where diversity has been affected by the extinctions associated with the flood. So we look at groups like fishes, tetrapods, you know, reptiles, mammals, birds, and they appear to be very distinct groups to us. But that could be because much of the diversity that was originally present in the pre-flood world has been destroyed. So we don't have today these reptile-like mammals. They're extinct. You know, we don't have these fish-like tetrapods because we don't have the floating forest. The floating forest never recovered after the flood, so those animals have gone extinct. So now things look much more distinct between a fish and a tetrapod, because the animals that God originally created that filled that kind of morphological gap in between were decimated by the flood. So bear in mind, when we look at the fossil record, we're seeing a world that was much richer, much more diverse than the world that we see today.
I remember, I think, a lecture from Dr. Cutrice, where he was speaking about diversity versus disparity.
Yes.
You may know the topic better than me, and maybe can you share something about that? Because it's like when we start to find animals in the fossil record, we get all the phyla very quickly. We
Yes.
don't have like a long evolution, step by step, one organism, then a second one, a second kind. Everything is right there at the beginning. Can you say what about this?
Yes, so there are these two concepts, diversity and disparity. Disparity refers to the differences between major body plans. So if you think about an invertebrate, like a lobster, which has an external skeleton, that's a very different body plan than, let's say, a mammal, which has an internal skeleton. It's a vertebrate, it has an internal skeleton. So these are just completely different body plans. So that's the concept of disparity. It's looking at these really different architectures of how you put an organism together. Diversity is about the variety within those major body plans. So if you take an arthropod, which has an external skeleton, there's a huge diversity of arthropods. You know, there are lobsters and crabs and shrimps and all kinds of other things too. Vertebrates, there are reptiles and mammals and birds and fishes, and they're all vertebrates. So you have lots of diversity, and then of course diversity even within those groups too. So we have this concept of disparity. They're the really big structural differences, and then we have diversity, which are the varieties within each of those big structural sort of architectures. And one of the things that you would expect, I think, if you were an evolutionist, is that greater disparity would arise from diversity. So you'd begin with relatively low disparity, but as organisms then diversified and became more and more diverse, eventually you would end up with more disparate groups that had very different architectures, but that would arise over time. So you'd have low disparity, and then you would get high disparity later. But what we actually see in the fossil record is in those earliest Cambrian rocks, where we have the first really abundant sort of multi-celled animals sort of showing up. We do have, you know, some in the uppermost Precambrian, but they're quite different sorts of animals. Or different sorts of organisms. But in the Cambrian, we have this wide diversity of different body plans. You know, we have many disparate groups that show up quite abruptly in the Cambrian in a fairly sort of short time window from an evolutionary perspective. And it's only later that we then get more diversity within those groups. So the pattern seems to be the wrong way round. We actually have high disparity early on and then increasing diversity, whereas from an evolutionary perspective we ought to have low disparity to begin with, and then high disparity should arise as those organisms diversify. So it seems, yeah, it's almost like the evolutionary tree is kind of upside down. It's the wrong way up.
Yeah, it's aligned with what you say about the transitional fossils. We speak about transitional fossils because we have a few cases to debate, but what we see is an abrupt appearance, and also something, maybe you can say a word about it, stasis.
Yes, so these are the sort of patterns that we see most commonly in the fossil record, is abrupt appearance, where organisms appear abruptly. They're not apparently led up to by, you know, transitional forms. And then they'll often stay, basically the morphology is very stable until they disappear from the fossil record. So we call this stasis. So they'll stay morphologically sort of the same, basically, or very similar through the fossil record. So we have abrupt appearance, we'll often have abrupt disappearance, you know, which is interpreted in the evolutionary model as an extinction event, but stasis in between. So things are not sort of, you're not seeing lots of evolution, lots of morphological change. Okay, and another interesting feature in the fossil record is the tracks, the fossil tracks. We find, for example, tracks of trilobites before the hard parts of trilobites, or tracks of birds before birds, or tracks of amphibians before amphibians. Yes. So it's very strange. From an evolutionist perspective, I heard Dr. Marcus Ross, he said that we would expect the hard parts before the tracks. And yeah, we can explain it with a flood, but it's quite difficult with the evolutionary perspective. Can you say something about this? Yeah, well, I think you've made the point quite well. So, you know, if you think from an evolutionary perspective, you would expect that the body fossils and the tracks should appear in the same, you know, the track makers, the bodies of the track makers and the tracks they're leaving behind should appear in the same rock layers, or if anything, as you said, Marcus Ross had pointed out, you should get the body fossils first because they're more likely to be preserved. But the pattern that we actually find is that typically it's the tracks that appear first. You see this with dinosaurs, you see it with, as you say, birds, we see it with the tetrapods that I mentioned earlier, where the, you know, the tracks of the tetrapods are appearing, you know, maybe 18 million years in conventional terms below the body fossils of the tetrapods. We see it with trilobites. So how do we explain this? Well, if you think about the flood and the way that the flood waters sort of progressed, you know, and began to devastate these pre-flood environments, for a time, animals would have been able to sort of move around and leave tracks while they were still living. You know, they would have been able to sort of, the trilobites would have been able to burrow and leave their tracks. Dinosaurs would have been able to run and leave their tracks. But then eventually those organisms will become exhausted. They'll be overwhelmed by the flood. They'll drown. You know, they'll expire, and that's when the body fossils would show up. And so we can explain this general pattern of finding trackways below body fossils. It's kind of what you would expect during the flood. The animals were alive for a time, able to leave tracks, but eventually they'll die, and that's when the body fossils will be buried. But from an evolutionary perspective, yeah, that pattern is quite hard to explain. It's quite counterintuitive. Yeah, and I tried to read some publication of Dr. John Baumgartner, but these are very complicated because he explains that there were many tsunamis and that the water could advance and then recede. Yeah, well, I think it's tied up with tectonics, which is one of the reasons John Baumgartner is very interested in this topic, because as you increase the rate of seafloor spreading, so, you know, we have the mid-ocean ridges where new ocean floor is being produced, and during the flood in John Baumgartner's catastrophic plate tectonics model, ocean floor would have been produced at rates of maybe a meter or more a second. This hot rock that is welling up at the mid-ocean ridges at these incredible sort of rates would have been more buoyant. It would have been thermally expanded, thermally buoyant compared to the old sea floor that it was replacing. And so what this does is it elevates the level of the ocean floor, and that displaces ocean water then onto the continents. So in much the same way, some of your viewers may remember back, I think it was 2006, there was that tsunami on Boxing Day, where a relatively modest sort of flexing of the ocean floor because of an earthquake caused that devastating tsunami where, you know, many people lost their lives. But But imagine during the flood that the ocean floor is being flexed, not by a few feet or a few meters, but maybe, you know, a kilometer or more. This is going to generate enormous earthquakes, mega earthquakes. It's going to cause massive tsunamis. It's going to cause enormous displacement of ocean water onto the continents. And that's probably going to be somewhat pulsed. And, you know, tectonics, we know that there are variations in seafloor spreading rates through time. So, you know, this might produce a kind of pulsing whereby you get pulses of ocean water that are then going, you know, extending over the continents. This may help to explain these mega sequences. So back in the 60s, geologists who were working in oil and gas exploration began to realize that these sedimentary strata that spanned North America formed large packages which they called sequences. And there are 6 of them that have been mapped across the North American continent. So they typically begin with a sandstone or even a kind of basal conglomerate, which is a coarse-grained layer. And then you have a shale, a mudstone layer, which is a bit finer. And then you have like a limestone. And these are basically the product of waning currents. So you have deepening water and waning current energy that can explain these fining upward sequences. And there are six of them, 6 mega sequences across North America. And there is some evidence that you can sort of map them on other continents as well. And so they could be evidence of this pulsing of ocean water onto the flood, you know, that you have these multiple sort of sequential transgressive events that are then producing these mega sequences across the continents.
I remember reading an article, I don't remember if it was on BBC News or something like that, and it says that once UK was underwater, and I found the same with France. It's amazing because the skeptics will tell you, okay, where does the water come from? But at the meantime, the evolutionists will say that, yeah, France was underwater, yes, UK was underwater. It was 200 million years ago, but they recognize that it was underwater. So it's very interesting. What do you think about this?
Yes, well, where does the water come from? It came from the ocean basins. So if you look at the way that the world is structured today with very deep ocean basins and the high standing continents and high mountains, you know, like the Himalayas, for example, you would think, well, maybe there isn't enough water to flood the entire world. But those mountain chains, those very high mountain chains, are geologically quite recent features. So we think that they rose up at the end of the flood and into the post-flood period. And because of the catastrophic tectonics that was taking place in the ocean basins, you know, this thermally buoyant sort of new ocean floor that was being produced, that raised the level of the ocean floor. In effect, the ocean basin shallowed. They became shallower, and the impact of that would be that ocean water is then displaced onto the continents. So we do have enough water to flood the world if those ocean basins become shallower, as they would have done as a consequence of catastrophic plate tectonics. And then where did the water go? Well, after the flood, you know, as catastrophic plate tectonics begins to slow down and eventually kind of switch off, that ocean floor would have begun to cool, it would have subsided, the ocean basins would have begun to deepen, and eventually the water that was on the continents would have drained back into the ocean basins. So we have a mechanism to explain where the water came from and how it got back into the ocean basins.
Okay, let's jump back to some transitional species or the evolution of dinosaurs into birds. Does it make any sense? Maybe you could say a word about the dinosaur demise in the Cretaceous level as well.
Yeah, so today there's a lot of attention on birds as sort of feathered dinosaurs. Yeah, the evolutionary sequence here in the fossil record is not quite as good in the sense of there being a consistent sort of series through time. But nevertheless, there are some morphological intermediates in the fossil record which evolutionists point to. So, of course, the classic one is Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx, the name means ancient wing. It was a fossil organism that was found back in 1861. It was first described by Richard Owen, I think, in 1863. So this is just after the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species. So this is the context into which this discovery is made. It was discovered in Bavaria, in southeastern Germany, in the Solnhofen limestones. And it was a kind of magpie-sized animal. What was really interesting about it is that it had clear imprints of feathers on the forelimbs and along both sides of the tail. These were feathers that were basically identical to those found in modern flying birds. But Archaeopteryx, we know, also had some features which are not found in modern birds, or not typically found in modern birds. So it had clawed digits on its wings. It had a long bony tail. It had teeth. You know, there are no modern birds that have true teeth. And so Thomas Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog, he was kind of Darwin's champion. He leapt on Archaeopteryx, you know, and said, this is exactly the kind of transitional fossil that we would expect, you know, if reptiles had evolved into birds. It has this sort of mixture of reptile-like and bird-like traits. And after that, you know, there was this kind of broad consensus that emerged that birds had evolved from reptiles, although there was a lot of disagreement about exactly which group of reptiles. Some people said dinosaurs. Huxley favored dinosaurs. Others, you know, favored other groups of reptiles. And then in 1969, there was an American paleontologist, John Ostrom. He described a new dinosaur from the southwestern USA called Deinonychus, which means terrible claw. So this was a kind of slender bipedal carnivorous dinosaur, but it had many features of its skeleton that were quite similar to Archaeopteryx. It had long forearms, it had three-fingered hands with very curved claws, and it had a very flexible wrist, which meant that it could sort of fold up its hands in a way similar to the way birds fold up their wings. And so that and some other discoveries sort of led to this renaissance in the idea that dinosaurs and birds are connected, that birds effectively evolved from theropod dinosaurs. And in the mid-90s, there were a whole series of discoveries, particularly from China, remarkable discoveries of what have become known as feathered dinosaurs. So I think the first to be discovered was Sinosauropteryx. That was in 1996, I think. And it had it was a little dinosaur, but it had a kind of fuzzy covering, a sort of fuzzy filamentous sort of covering that ran all the length of its body from head to tail. And then there was, in 97, there was this creature Caudipteryx that was discovered, about the size of a modern peacock. It had long legs, so it was probably a fast runner. But it had hands that were covered in what looked like true feathers. So it had symmetrical feathers with a central vein, barbs coming off each side. It had a sort of short, stumpy tail with a fan of tail feathers. And then we've even found these very weird, very strange feathered dinosaurs in China that are sometimes referred to as the four-winged dinosaurs, things like Microraptor, which is a little dromaeosaur, and it had feathers on both its forelimbs and on its hind limbs, and it had a long feathered tail. It was probably some kind of glider. So we found now a whole load of these sort of feathered dinosaurs, and again, you know, evolutionists will point to this and say, well, this is exactly, you know, what we'd expect if dinosaurs had evolved into birds. of course, as creationists, we reject this idea because the Bible is quite clear that God created the flying things separately from the land animals. The flying things were made on day 5 of creation week, and the land animals were made on day 6. So we don't think that, you know, birds evolved from dinosaurs. But I do think that feathered dinosaurs are real. I know there's been a lot of discussion. This is a very contentious
yes,
topic.
with Alan Fiducia.
Yes.
It's collagen, it's not feathers, but what do you think?
Yes, I think it's not. Yeah, so you've got this group. Alan Fiducia is perhaps the most prominent of them within the mainstream community. So these are evolutionists, but they've disputed this idea of sort of feathered dinosaurs, and they've said, well, you know, maybe these are sort of non-flying birds, true birds, or maybe these sort of fuzzy coverings aren't really true feathers. Maybe they're decayed collagen fibers from the decay of the animal. I think the evidence has grown that that even these filamentous structures are feathers of some kind. They're hollow, unlike collagen fibers. They've been found in association with pigments, with melanosomes, pigment cells, so which you don't find in collagen. So it does look to me as if there's some kind of feather, some sort of simple sort of feather. And then there are other dinosaurs that have what look like true feathers, you know, where there's no debate really about the fact that these are sort of barbed feathered structures. So I think feathered dinosaurs are real. The question is, are they evidence of the evolution of birds from dinosaurs? And I don't see that necessarily follows. There's nothing in the Bible that says that God couldn't have endowed animals other than birds with feathers. The Bible just doesn't tell us that. And so I think we're sort of just free to see this as part of the incredible diversity that God made in that world, that existed in that world before the flood, that there were feathered animals that were not birds. And again, we've done some baraminology to try to sort of make sense of, you know, what are the relationships between these different groups. And again, we find that birds and dinosaurs are clearly separate. They fall into discrete clusters, as we'd expect from what the Bible says. But there are feathered animals that fall among the dinosaurs, so among the dromaeosaurs or among the oviraptors, or you know, there are feathered animals within those. Archaeopteryx may be a dinosaur, you know, it bounces around a bit in some of the analyses. But it could well just be a little feathered dromaeosaur. So to me, as a creationist, it doesn't seem that big a deal. I think it just displays something of the glory of God, the incredible diversity of things that he made. But there are creationists who, you know, are very uncomfortable with the idea of feathered dinosaurs and have pushed back. But I tend to think that the evidence is pretty clear that there were feathered animals that fall on the dinosaur side of the, you know, of the divide. But to me, that doesn't really bother me too much as a creationist. I just see it as evidence of the incredible diversity of the pre-flood world.
Yeah, and I mean feathered dinosaurs. It would not mean especially evolution, as you mentioned.
Right.
And the evolutionists, they also have a problem of the fossil tracks of birds that we talked about, and it's dated around 200 million years ago. So it's older than any ancestors. It's the same problem as with Tiktaalik or with the tracks of tetrapod. Right. So they don't have like a progressive evolution case here.
Right. Yeah. The fossil sequence it's not such a convincing transitional series here as perhaps, say, the reptile-like mammals, or the mammal-like reptiles rather, or the fish tetrapod sequence. So we have these morphological intermediates, but they don't fall into such a neat sort of temporal sequence as some of these other examples.
Okay, the last evolution case would be the evolution of man from an ape-like creature, what can we say about this? Because it requires huge changes. We don't have the same spine, the same knees, the same inner ear, and yet the evolution process is supposed to be step by step. But we need lots of changes and very fast changes to make evolution work. Otherwise, the intermediary creature is not functional. So where are we in terms of genetic process that would demonstrate evolution is possible? And what about fossils that would supposedly show the progression of apes toward humans?
Yeah, I probably can't say too much about the genetics because that's not really my field, but I can say something about the fossils for sure. So if you look at, as you've said, if you look at modern humans and modern apes today, there are some very clear anatomical differences. We have very different body proportions. You know, we have relatively long legs and short arms, whereas a chimpanzee or a gorilla has relatively short legs and longer arms. We have differences in brain size. We have differences in the shape and structure of our pelvis, our hip bones. We have very flat faces, whereas apes tend to have a more protruding sort of muzzle. So there are lots of sort of significant differences. When we look at the fossil record, the picture gets a bit more complicated because we have a whole series of fossils again that appear to have curious combinations of characters. So we have, for example, the Australopithecines, the so-called southern apes, which are found in Africa. They're dated in conventional terms to about 3 to 4 million years ago. They're relatively small-brained. They have sort of ape-like body proportions in many ways, but they also have some features that indicate that they were bipedal. So, for example, the foramen magnum, which is the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord enters, in an ape, in a modern ape, it's sort of at the back of the skull so that the animal can face forwards, you know, when it's moving around on all fours. In a human, it's directly at the base of the skull so that we look forward when we're standing upright. And in the Australopithecines, it's effectively in the human location. They have a more human-shaped pelvis, although it's kind of doing its own thing, but it's more human-like in some ways. They have femurs which are angled inwards at the knee, which allows, in humans, it allows us to stand upright and to balance, to put the center of gravity over our over our midline so that we are able to stand and walk upright. And Australopithecines have some of these features. And then we also have a whole ragbag of fossil forms that get lumped together. They're called early Homo. Homo is our genus, you know, we're Homo sapiens. They have a medium-sized brain. They're a bit more human-like, but it's quite difficult to generalize because this tends to be a bit of a taxonomic wastebasket where lots of different things get placed. So it's a bit of a mess, perhaps. We've also got a bit later in the fossil sequence, we've got Homo erectus and Homo ergaster in Africa. These are quite different from the Australopithecines. They're from the neck down, they're quite modern in appearance. You might have to be quite an expert to be able to tell the difference, but you know, between from these and a modern human skeleton. But the skulls are quite different. So they have no chin. You know, we have a prominent chin, but the Homo erectus has a kind of no chin here. They had very large brow ridges. They had, on average, a smaller brain size than modern humans. So there are some differences in terms of the skull, but otherwise, from the neck down, quite human-looking. And then we've got Neanderthals. Neanderthals, quite modern in appearance, quite stocky, quite sort of muscular, squat sort of body shape, but again with distinctive features of the skull. So they have heavy brow ridges, again no chin. On average, their brain was a bit larger than modern humans, interestingly. So so we have all of this diversity, you know, in the fossil record. And again, evolutionists see this as a fossil series. So Australopithecines, they're regarded as, you know, the transitional form, the human ancestor, where they're making this first transition to bipedal walking, coming down from the trees as you get the spread of the grassy plains in Africa. You know, they're sort of evolving to sort of inhabit that environment, and then you eventually lead through sort of Erectus and Neanderthals and modern humans. Again, when we've applied baraminology, Dr. Todd Wood has done a lot of work in this area, applying baraminology to the hominin fossils. And again, what's really interesting about this is that you find very discrete groups. So you have a human group, and you have non-human apes. So these non-human apes include essentially all of the Australopithecines, apart from one, which is what we can come back to, but the other Australopithecines appear to be non-humans. In the human group, we've got modern humans, Homo sapiens, we've got Neanderthals, Homo erectus, Homo naledi, you know, the new hominin that was found back in 2015 in South Africa, that clusters with the humans. So you have this discrete human group, and you have non-human primates, and very consistently across all of the data sets that have been studied, you know, with different combinations of taxa, different combinations of character traits, we find consistently that separation, which is really interesting. The kind of big fly in the ointment, at least for some people, is that one Australopithecine, Australopithecus sediba, consistently seems to cluster with the human group, and that has caused a lot of people to sort of raise their eyebrows. Having said that, Australopithecus sediba is regarded as the most human-like of the Australopithecines. It may not even be Australopithecus. There are some people who think that it ought to be classified as Homo sediba. And it is interesting that all of the other members of the genus Homo cluster in the human group. So that may, you know, that's kind of neither here nor there in one sense. The big picture is that we really do find discrete human and non-human groups, even with all of this diversity in the fossil record. It does suggest that in the early history of humanity, you know, when man was spreading out after the flood, spreading out from Babel, that humanity was really very diverse. There were people that
much more diverse than now.
Yes, more diverse than now. I mean, we look at humanity now and there's a lot of diversity, but it was even more so, it seems, in the past. And there's one very interesting site in Eastern Europe, in the former Republic of Georgia, called Dmanisi, where excavations below a medieval village, they came to much older deposits, and they found among these ancient deposits, they found 5 fossil skulls. They appear to have all been living about the same time in this one tiny area. So they may well have all been living together, and yet these skulls are quite different from one another, but they all appear to be human. So incredible diversity in one location. I mean, these skulls are so different that had you found them in different layers or in different locations, you might have attributed them to different species. And yet they were living together in this one place. And interestingly, it's not very far from the biblical location of Babel. So it looks as if when humanity was spreading out from Babel, yeah, humanity was really very much more diverse even than it is today.
Okay, I was discussing recently with Henry Smith from ABR, Archaeology Ministry. And, you know, we discussed the age of the earth according to the Bible and the date of the flood. And, you know, the age can be around 6,000 to 7,500 years old. And Noah's flood would have been 2,500 BC or maybe 3,300 BC.
Mm-hmm.
So at best, after the flood, we have something like 5,000 years ago, 5,000 years. So how do you get all the civilization into such a short time? Because the evolutionists will tell you, how do you put Neanderthal, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, or Australopithecines, the saber-toothed tiger, the dinosaurs? Of course, we think they were dragons, but how do you get all of that in just 5,000 years?
Yes, and of course, if the flood ends at the end of the Mesozoic, we have the earlier part of the Cenozoic too. So we have the diversification of the mammals, and in the Cenozoic and the birds. So we have a lot going on in that early part of the period after the flood. So I think in terms of biological diversity, we've got to think in terms, as creationists, we've got to think in terms of mechanisms that are much faster than traditional neo-Darwinian mechanisms. We can't rely on just mutation and natural selection to do the job. It's got to be faster than that. So creationists have made a number of suggestions. Dr. Todd Wood has talked about the role, and others have talked about the role of mobile genetic elements, which are bits of sort of DNA that can move around within and between genomes and can turn other genes on or off.
Epigenetics.
So there's all kinds of things like that which can produce diversity quite quickly. There may have been other designed mechanisms, even directed mutations and chromosomal rearrangements. So that's sort of an active area of creationist research. In terms of this human, what's really interesting is all of those fossils that we were talking about, the Australopithecines and then the Homo fossils, they're found right towards the top of the Cenozoic. So we have mammal diversification apparently happening after the flood, but it's not until quite late that then the first humans start to show up, and that could be partly explained by the longevity of people after the flood. Maybe bodies aren't showing up until later because they're living for those very long lifespans, but also because humans probably stayed in relatively small numbers in one place until Babel, until they were scattered, and then began to sort of spread out across the earth. So I think there are ways that we can explain that. What's interesting is when you look, for example, at the stone tool record, you have these different stone tool cultures that successively replace one another in the archaeological record. And again, you see something similar that you see in the fossil record. You see the sudden appearance of a stone tool culture, and then it will just stay static for a very long period of time, apparently. And then it will just almost overnight be replaced, or a new stone tool technology will be introduced. And it kind of, to me, that's an anomaly, because if these people are clever enough to develop these stone tool technologies, why is their technology then stagnant for such a long period of time? I think it makes much more sense if you actually say that time period was much shorter, that rather than hundreds of thousands of years, maybe we're talking about a few years perhaps. And so I think a short time scale can help us to make some sense of some of those things that might otherwise be quite puzzling in the archaeological record. In terms of civilization, that's kind of outside of my area of expertise. That's probably something Henry Smith knows a great deal more about. But I would say that those civilizations kind of spring up after Babel, when humans are spreading out from Babel and beginning then to settle down and found civilizations. And it does seem that the older civilizations are in the region of the general region of the Tower of Babel, and then get younger as you get further away from Babel, which sort of fits a pattern of biblical migration from that region.
Okay, so thank you very much, Paul, for your insights.
My pleasure. It's been great to be
helpful,
here.
I think, for the French audience. And maybe last question, something we share between France and England is the chalk cliff. And,
Yes.
you know, in Dover, we say the falaises of Etretat. But, you know, the evolutionists would say that you need millions of years to form these chalks. You cannot do it in a few years or in a few months. What can you say about this?
Yes, interesting. I've looked at the chalk in Britain, obviously. For the very first time, I went to have a look at the chalk in France in September. I was with a couple of other geologists. I was over in France for a creationist conference, and afterwards we drove out to Dieppe to look at the chalk cliffs there. And we're talking about the possibility of doing a research project actually on the chalk. So that would be interesting, a kind of, you know, European collaboration looking at the chalk from a creationist perspective. Yeah, does it take millions of years? Well, one of the things that strikes you about the chalk is its purity. So the chalk is composed of planktonic organisms called coccolithophores. They produce calcium carbonate skeletons, and they shed these calcium carbonate plates called coccoliths, and they make up the bulk of the chalk. And so you can imagine, you know, billions or trillions of these things are needed to form the chalk. But one of the things that is puzzling about the chalk is its purity. Some chalk samples can be sort of 98 pure calcium carbonate with very little sort of mixture of other materials. And that to me suggests that maybe it was deposited quite rapidly, because otherwise how do you keep other materials out for so long? If you're thinking about the chalk being deposited over 30 million years, how do you keep, you know, lots of clay out, for example, or sand? We have macrofossils within the chalk which are quite well preserved, again suggesting they were buried rapidly. The chalk doesn't look like we used to think of it as a very placid kind of environment, just this sort of very placid, calm seafloor environment where you had this rain of coccolith material to the floor of the ocean. But in France, in Normandy, you can see exposures where there are large banks of chalk and cross bedding in the chalk and channels that have been cut into the chalk. So we're now realizing that the chalk environment was much more dynamic than this calm, placid sea that we're used to thinking about. So there's some evidence of rapid burial. So how could the chalk have been deposited? I think it was as enormous blooms. So these microscopic organisms living in the water column, when the conditions are just right, when the temperature and the nutrients in the water are just right, and the turbulence in the water is just right, these things can just bloom and turn the water white. They multiply at extraordinary rates. And I think at this particular point in the flood, the conditions were just right for these organisms to just kind of explode. And so I think that was how the chalk was deposited. It was a one-off rapid event rather than something that was slowly formed. We don't have in the world today thick deposits of chalk being formed. You know, there's something very strange going on, and I think it's to do with the conditions, the environmental conditions at that particular point in the flood, that can help us to unlock the mystery of the chalk.